It is my pleasure on behalf of the entire library team to welcome everybody to our third installment of Faculty Pub Night, where we are going to welcome Associate Professor Molly Youngkin to discuss her book entitled British Women Writers and the Reception of Ancient Egypt, 1840 to 1910, Imperialist Representations of Egyptian Women. Before we begin tonight's formal program, just a quick words about Faculty Pub Night. Number one, it is not for faculty only, so I'm happy to see some students in the audience, so please spread the word to your friends as well, okay? A free way to score some free snacks and drinks as well. So another note about Faculty Pub Night, it is not 21 and over. Yes, we do serve alcoholic drinks, but we have Rebecca, our bartender, who's gonna be checking IDs, so try not to be slick if you're under 21, please. All right. Also, we provide a casual environment during today's event, so at any point during the event, please feel free to grab some snacks and drinks. Also, there is going to be time for questions at the end. And lastly, on your chairs, there are these feedback forms that we would really appreciate if you fill out. At the end of that feedback form, modeled by Michael Robinson, thank you, Michael. If you fill that out and provide your email address, you will automatically be entered into a raffle for a $100 Amazon gift card. Might come in handy. Okay, so let's get this started. So at this point, I would like to welcome to the podium LMU alumnus and the professor's former student, Michael Robinson, to formally introduce tonight's speaker. Michael?
So if I actually did this in Molly Youngkin's class, she would take points off for the folds. But oh, I should have my glasses on. That would help. So, Professor Youngkin is here tonight to share with you a little volume she calls, in 25 words or less, British Women Writers and the Reception of Ancient Egypt, 1840 to 1910, Imperialist Representations of Egyptian Women. She is, as an aside, one of the few English professors I've had that didn't question the length of the titles of my paper. You might ask, what does that title mean? Well, for now, it means you need to wait for her to get up here. My job is to briefly share with you what a treat you are in for. I'm going to assume that you have done your reading before coming tonight, that you read the flyer or got a hold of the book and read about the author, so I won't go over that. I was asked to introduce Molly Youngkin tonight, partly because I've been her student, and partly because I spent a semester as her research assistant on this new book of hers. And I said yes before it hit me that meant I would have to say nice things about her in front of people, because that's what one does when one introduces someone. But then I realized that saying nice things about Professor Youngkin wasn't the problem. Here at LMU, I would be speaking to the choir, particularly here at the library, which is like her second classroom, and a place where she has turned on many of her students to the singular joys of handling 150-year-old books and artifacts. No, the problem was actually twofold. Finding nice things to say about her that haven't been said millions of times before, or at least a few times, and second, how to refer to her. When I first met her 5 or so years ago, she was just Professor Youngkin. Then at some point she became interim chair Youngkin. Then she was out of here on sabbatical Youngkin. And now she's Dean Youngkin. Associate Dean Youngkin. My favorite is Professor Youngkin, so here goes. First and foremost, Professor Youngkin is an amazing teacher. Amazing because she has a gift for engaging her students, by which I mean she teaches them from the inside out. She gets in your head and jumpstarts whatever ability you have to think about literature, authors, the world of authors and their books. Her enthusiasm for the Victorian era, her passion for the books of women writing and living during that era is infectious. Everything I learned about Jane Austen, Wuthering Heights, and Rider Haggard, I didn't learn in kindergarten, but in one of Professor Youngkin's classes. What was taboo to learn in Molly Youngkin's class back in the day was what happened on Sunday's Downton Abbey. If anyone missed the episode, she was strict that there would be no spoilers in her class. at least until they killed off Mary's first husband, Matthew. But to get back on track, Professor Youngkin's great talent is her ability to pull you into her world of 19th century literature, inside the Victorian age, and give you the opportunity of not only looking at that important world through her eyes, but opening your eyes to the magic of those times, those books, those people, and the communities they lived in and even transformed. And that is the meaning of a Jesuit education a la Molly Youngkin. It is the education of the whole person by way of sensitizing the person to times and ideas distant from them and bridging that distance through empathy, intellectual rigor, and even a bit of humor. So tonight, Professor Youngkin will talk about her book, but as is her wont, she will also educate, sharing with you a bit on her research process and inviting us to journey with her and Florence Nightingale and George Eliot and Michael Field and Eleanor Glenn to an Egypt observed through an imperialistic lens. Please welcome Professor Molly Youngkin.
Thank you, Michael. That's really sweet. Yeah. Sorry, I lost my script. So thank you so much, Michael, for that really kind introduction. As Michael mentioned, he was my RA while I was finishing up this book project. And the other reason that I asked him to introduce me is because he is a devoted attendee of not only all library events, but events across the campus, right? You go to an event and Michael's always there. So, and he, like the rest of you, make these events a success. So thanks, Michael. So I also want to thank the many institutions and individuals who supported me during the writing of this book, and they're up on the screen, depending on your view, right? I especially want to thank Emily Kim, who's my current research assistant, and she's here tonight in the back. She did the spectacular, let's give her a round of applause. She did the spectacular PowerPoint that you're going to see tonight. PowerPoint is not really in my wheelhouse, and so I'm really grateful to Emily for working on this project with me. So tonight, I want to tell you about my latest book, British Women Writers and the Reception of Ancient Egypt, thanks to Emily for the curtain opening, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan about a year ago. So my talk will have three parts. I'll do an overview of the book project, in which I'll discuss how I came to this particular topic, the authors included in the book, what they knew about ancient Egypt, and how they used this knowledge in their writing about women's emancipation. I'll also talk about some of the challenges I encountered in doing the research for this book and how I responded to these challenges as a way to show some of you how you might respond to challenges in your own research projects. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the implications of the research that I've done, particularly in terms of how we might think about broader issues of recovering the work of women writers, what we can learn about British imperialism from looking at their work, and what we can learn about current popular interest in ancient Egypt. So first, to the overview of the project. I started working on this project in 2007, the year I came to LMU. So it took about 9 years to write. And it's been one of the most interesting projects that I've worked on, since I knew almost nothing about ancient Egypt when I started, and I didn't even realize that that was the topic that I would end up writing about. I started thinking that I wanted to write a book about the relationship about 19th century white women writers, since these are the writers I love to teach and read, and their relationship to women of color, since there were few women of color in the 19th century who had access to educational opportunities or the literary publishing world in the ways that white women did. When I started looking at white women writers' representations of women in color, what emerged as a commonality among these writers was that many of them were not writing about women of color per se, but they were writing about the ancient world, Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians, and ancient Egypt seemed to be one site for thinking about how white women viewed women of color, since there was at least some acceptance in the 19th century that Egyptians were people of color. Now, this was and continues to be an issue of debate, and we can discuss that debate in the Q&A if you want to. Once I focused on white women writers' representations of the ancient world, I found that they had the tendency to choose Greek or Italian women rather than Egyptian women as models for their own emancipation. And I believe this tendency reflects imperialist views about people of color and the East, that somehow ancient Egyptian women were too different from themselves and perhaps too dangerous to use in representations of their own emancipation. That said, white women writers were fascinated with ancient Egypt. And one of the things I learned from writing this book was that they knew much more about Egypt than typically has been acknowledged by literary critics and historians working in the 19th century. So after much reading about key British women writers, including some authors I didn't end up choosing, such as Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I remember doing a bunch of reading about Christina Rossetti and then realized I couldn't use her at all. I did choose four, well, technically five, but four authors to focus on. The first, Florence Nightingale, best known for her work as a nurse during the Crimean War in the 1850s, but who also wrote an important treatise about religious devotion and the emancipation of women, called Suggestions for Thought for Seekers After Religious Truth, published in 1860. Nightingale, like many 19th century women, struggled with her own desire for emancipation, since her decision to devote herself to caring for others was particularly upsetting to her family. Her family felt strongly that she should marry and live a much more traditional life, not, run off and become a nurse. Interestingly, the draft version of Suggestions for Thought includes references to ancient Egypt, which were dropped from the final draft, while the references to other cultures remained. So that interested me. I also chose George Eliot, whose given name was Marianne Evans, and who's particularly known for her decision to leave the Church of England after grappling with her own belief in God, as well as her decision to, quote, live in sin with her still married partner, the writer George Henry Lewis. Many of Eliot's novels feature women characters who desire emancipation, but often accept duty to family or society over their own desires. And her novel, Daniel Deronda, published in 1876, puts these issues into an Eastern context when the English heroine Gwendolyn Harleth, who is described, among other things, as an Egyptian mummy in the novel, develops a friendship with the Jewish title character, Daniel Deronda, who's described as an accomplished Egyptian in the novel. My third author, which is actually two authors, was Michael Field, the poet and dramatist comprised of two women, Catherine Bradley and Edith Cooper, an aunt and niece who worked together and lived together romantically. Their work exemplifies late 19th century aestheticism, or the art for art's sake movement, while also pushing boundaries through their depiction of women via their lesbian lens on aestheticism. They were particularly known for their love of the visual arts, and much of their poetry, including the 1892 collection, Sight and Song, is based on famous paintings of women they saw in museums across Europe. They also published in 1908 5 sonnets that feature ancient Egyptian women, and a play called Queen Mariamne, in which the title character is developed by contrasting the Greek Aphrodite with Cleopatra, who fashioned herself after the Egyptian goddess Isis. And then my final author was Eleanor Glenn, who's best known for writing romances in the early 20th century that were made into popular movies in 1920s Hollywood. And of course, those of you who know me very well, you know why I chose this portrait, right? It's really because of the cats, the twin cats, right? So I just couldn't resist. There were other choices, but I had to go for the cat portrait. Although Glenn herself held more traditional ideas about women's rights than some of the other women in my study, and she opposed women's suffrage, for example, she did believe in what she called spiritual unions, romances outside of marriage that allowed for fuller expression of love than the typical marriage experienced by upper-class British women such as herself. Her 1907 novel, 3 Weeks, features an Eastern European lady, she's sort of unnamed throughout the novel, but she's referred to as a lady, who seduces a young British man across multiple countries, including Italy, Greece, and Egypt, and she's characterized both as an ancient Greek goddess and as Cleopatra in the novel. While all of these writers are known to literary critics who study this period of literature, Nightingale and Eliot are writers we would consider canonized, not only well known in their own time, but remembered and read more than 100 years later, while Field and Glenn are what we would call non-canonical, well known in their own time, but not necessarily remembered or read today. My primary aims for the book, whether I was discussing canonical or non-canonical writers, was to look at texts by writers that had already been discussed by literary critics from a particular perspective. For example, the religious context for Nightingale's Suggestions for Thought, the Jewish context for Eliot's Daniel Deronda, the lesbian context for Field's poetry, and the cinematic context for Glenn's 3 Weeks. And I wanted to look at their work from a different perspective, one that accounted for the writer's knowledge about ancient Egypt. So, what did these writers know about ancient Egypt, and how did they know it? What they knew about ancient Egypt varied from one author to another, of course, but generally speaking, they, like most 19th century Britons, knew that ancient Egypt was a powerful civilization, one that modern Britain might emulate in some ways. But they also understood that Britain had a conflicted relationship with modern Egypt, since it was controlled by the Ottomans and desired by the French, as evident by Napoleon's 1798 expedition to the country. In other words, their admiration for ancient Egypt was tempered by their anxieties about modern Egypt's political position. British women writers also generally believed that ancient Egypt offered much in the way of their own religious growth, since they saw parallels between the ancient gods and Christian figures. And I thought this was really interesting. For example, they often discuss the god of the afterlife, Osiris, as parallel to Jesus. And we especially see that in Nightingale's letters home when she's in Egypt. They also, oh, sorry, I didn't click at the right time. They also were interested in ancient Egyptian goddesses and their power as nurturing mothers. For example, they knew that goddesses such as Mot, goddess of harmony, who stabilized the universe by regulating the seasons, and Nut, the goddess of the sky, who created a protective buffer between the worlds of the gods and the earthly world, were central in the creation process. And they admired the goddess of love, Hathor, and the goddess Isis, who's often depicted as an ideal mother, for their nurturing qualities. Still, British imperialist views again entered into how women writers used ancient Egyptian women in their literary work. Their awareness that ancient Egyptian women had significant power, especially as compared to Greek women, and their belief that modern Egyptian women were somehow oppressed, in their view, because of the influence of Muslim culture in Egypt, led them to favor Greek and Italian women over Egyptian women in their writing about women's emancipation, so as not to alienate their British audience. And I mentioned that before, so just to reiterate that. So moving on to how they knew about ancient Egypt, I thought you might be interested to hear, who traveled there, who didn't. Certainly, some of them traveled to Egypt and saw images of ancient Egyptian men and women in the temples that they visited. Although travel to Egypt was not common among the British upper classes until the 1860s, when Thomas Cook's travel agency sponsored tours on a weekly basis, Florence Nightingale traveled to Egypt in the late 1840s with some family friends as part of a longer trip that included Italy and Greece. And this was, common to cover multiple countries while you were traveling. And while in Egypt, she traveled a significant distance down the Nile, which was uncommon for white women at this time. Nightingale's descriptions of her travel in her letters home to family and friends capture well the imperialist perspective she and other Britons held. She writes that although the colors of the eastern landscape are like, quote, precious stones, she also finds the contrast between this landscape and the Western European landscapes to be, quote, unnatural. In Italy, she writes, there are crimson lights and purple shadows. Here there is nothing in the air, earth, air, sky, or water, which one can compare in any way to Europe, end quote. Further, when she visits the eastern Arabian desert, she writes that she sees, quote, an awful devil at work, and that it is the deadness of the sky in Egypt as compared to the rich and variegated English landscape that allows the devil to dominate over God in Egypt. Like Nightingale, Eleanor Glenn traveled to Egypt in the early 20th century, but by this time it had become more common for Britons of a certain class to do so. As a member of the aristocratic class, Glenn was part of the Cairo social circle that included British administrators who were working in Egypt during Britain's occupation from 1882 to 1922, an experience not all British travelers would have had. Glenn's activities in Egypt were less adventurous than Nightingale's because she sort of stuck to her social circle, which, very interestingly, held 18th century themed European balls for entertainment. So in her memoir, we hear her talking about her children like putting on powdered wigs and stuff when they go to these balls. Yet she did venture out, again with her children, to see the Sphinx at Giza, a decision that was controversial among her friends. She wrote passionately about this and other visits to see the Sphinx in her memoir, stating, only the Sphinx and the vast desert impressed themselves upon the consciousness of those who gazed, and the experience was unforgettable. New, deep thoughts and emotions surged up in me as I stared at this strange form. I seemed to feel myself become a part of that immortal being whom these ancient Egyptians sought to commemorate with this strange edifice of stone. So both Nightingale and Glenn did travel to Egypt. George Eliot and Michael Field both wanted to go to Egypt and talked about the possibility in their letters to friends, since they knew people who went, but they were never able to make the trip. Certainly they had the financial means to go. In Eliot's case, she didn't go because George Henry Lewis was too ill to make such a long trip. And in Field's case, it's not quite clear why they didn't go, but they did have the opportunity. In addition to traveling to Egypt in Nightingale and Glenn's cases, or in place of it in Eliot and Field's cases, these women writers read about ancient Egypt in books that were available to them. We know that Nightingale and Eliot read John Gardner Wilkinson's 1837 book, Manners and Customs of the Ancient Egyptians, as well as Edward Lane's 1836 book, An Account of the Manners and Customs of Modern Egyptians, which, while it focused on modern Egyptian life, also referred back to ancient Egyptian culture. And those of you who work with Google Books quite a bit, you probably recognize, oh, she probably got these title pages off of Google Books. I'm going to come back to Google Books in a bit, so I just wanted to point that out now. Remember these images. The list of other books Nightingale and Eliot read is long, so I won't name all of them, but Nightingale read all the books that were thought necessary for a well-informed traveler before her trip, and she met with the German scholar Christian Karl von Bunsen, author of the 5-volume Egypt's Place in Universal History, for advice before leaving on her trip. Eliot also read widely and thoroughly about all aspects of Egyptian culture, religion, but also history and language, and she really understood the details of this culture, which she recorded in her notebooks as she read. and I'll talk a little bit more about what she recorded in her notebooks in a bit. Documentation of what Field and Glenn read is not as extensive, but we do know that Field knew about ancient Egypt through their visits to the Egyptian Antiquities Department at the British Museum, and that's recorded in their journals. And they sometimes discuss European paintings they viewed, such as Edward Manet's 1863 painting Olympia, and Battista Dossi's 1544 painting The Dream in relationship to ancient Egypt. So in terms of the Manet painting, they write in their journals about the woman figure as a kind of Cleopatra, and one of the pharaohs who's discussed by Herodotus is referred to when they're talking about the Dossi painting. Eleanor Glenn probably did not read as widely, since she claims to have resisted her tutor's instructions as a child and not to have read much literature as an adult. And she didn't really hang out in literary circles either. But she did love and frequently reread Charles Kingsley's The Heroes or Greek Fairy Tales for Children, which was published in 1856, and it discussed the ancient Egyptians as well as the Greeks. She also was very much influenced by popular culture representations of ancient Egypt. For example, her sister, Lucy Duff Gordon, was a fashion designer who specialized in Greek-inspired dresses and gave her models Greek and Egyptian goddess names. And Glenn actually collaborated with her sister on some of these projects, so that was one of the influences on her, even though she apparently didn't like to read. So with this information about what British women writers knew about ancient Egypt and how they knew it, we can turn to how they used their knowledge in their writing about women's emancipation. I've already referred to the works by these women writers that I focus on in my book, and I want to stress that they wrote in diverse genres. So Nightingale and Eliot wrote, loosely speaking, fiction. Of course, Eliot wrote fiction, but I refer to Nightingale's Suggestions for Thought as fiction because there are some very fictional elements of it, especially in the early draft forms. And there's an image of Daniel Deronda for us. Glenn wrote in what we would consider the romance genre, which is a little bit different from fiction. And then, of course, Field wrote poetry and drama. So for the purpose of keeping to the time that we have tonight, I just want to talk about one of these authors' works, Eliot's Daniel Deronda, to give you a sense of how Eliot used her knowledge about ancient Egypt when writing the novel. I've already mentioned that Eliot read Wilkinson's and Lane's books, as well as a number of other books, and I want to say a little bit more about what she would have read and seen in Wilkinson's book before showing how this knowledge appears in Daniel Deronda. So as evident in her Commonplace book, one of the many notebooks that Eliot kept, Eliot noted this image in Wilkinson's book of Egyptian sculptures showing women weaving and using the distaff. So that's the notation that we get in her notebook that refers to this particular image. And she copied images by Wilkinson about ancient Egyptian women, including one about the privileges they enjoyed as compared to women from other ancient societies. For example, the Egyptian women appear to have enjoyed greater privileges and to have been treated with more courtesy on all occasions than in other ancient communities. Following this statement, she makes notes about their access to wine, a privilege not extended to ancient Greek women, their control over their husbands, especially with regard to household matters, and their access to royal authority, but not to holy office for gods and goddesses. So these are all notations that we see in her notebooks. She also copied into her notebook Wilkinson's comments about ancient Egyptian marriage, which he drew from Diodorus, the 1st century BCE Greek historian. Egyptians were not restricted to any number of wives, but everyone generally married as many as he chose. It does not, however, appear that they took advantage of this privilege, and Herodotus affirms that throughout Egypt it was customary to marry only one wife. So that's another direct copy that we get in the notebooks. Still, Eliot did not overlook the fact that some Egyptian men had multiple partners through harems. She copied Wilkinson's explanation that harems included both white and black women slaves, who typically would have been foreigners won in war or imported to be sold as slaves. Nevertheless, the children of these women would have had the same rights of inheritance as did the children of legitimate wives, a custom the critic Joseph Wiesenfarth, editor of Eliot's commonplace book, believes informed Eliot's writing of one of the subplots in Daniel Deronda, that of Lydia Glasher as Grandcourt's mistress. I'll get to the plot of Daniel Deronda in a minute, but the main point I want to make about Eliot's notes in her commonplace book is that even as she might have absorbed the imperialist attitudes expressed by writers such as Wilkinson, who were presenting ancient Egypt from an imperialist perspective, she also understood the privilege accorded ancient Egyptian women. In addition to understanding something about the privileges and powers accorded mortal ancient Egyptian women, Eliot was well aware of the privileges and powers possessed by ancient Egyptian goddesses. Though she did not record her knowledge of these goddesses until after Daniel Deronda was published, it's reasonable to think that she knew about these goddesses well before the novel was published, since discussion of them in British culture was widespread. And this is an image. I'll go this way. You can look either way. Again, from Google Books. Here we can actually see the Google emblem, right? I'm going to come back to that. Here we see the title page of Amelia B. Edwards's 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. And Eliot actually included word-for-word transcriptions from Edwards's book, which was published the same year as Daniel Deronda. And her transcriptions actually come from, I know you can't see this, but they're in the appendix, there are lists of gods and goddesses and their powers. So towards the bottom of this page on the appendix, we get the male gods first, and then on to the next page, the male gods continue. We get Ra, Osiris, Thoth, etc., Horus. And then towards the bottom of this page, we get descriptions of Mount, Isis, Nut, Hathor, and others. And the descriptions that we have here are copied word for word by Eliot into her notebooks. So that's why I'm showing you those particular images. So with this information in mind about what Eliot knew about ancient Egypt, how did she use this knowledge in the writing of Daniel Deronda? So I know some of you are very familiar with this novel. Just be patient for a minute. I know there are probably more people who are not familiar with this novel or are familiar with it but haven't necessarily read it. So I just want to briefly say a little bit about the plot. As I've already mentioned, the novel's two main characters are Gwendolyn Harleth and Daniel Deronda. Gwendolyn is a young English woman who spends her time gambling away her family's money in continental Europe until the death of her stepfather forces her to return to England, where she marries Grandcourt, who already has children with his mistress Lydia. Daniel Deronda is a young Englishman who meets Gwendolyn on the continent, strikes up a friendship with her, doesn't realize he's Jewish through his mother's side of the family, but once he's aware of his heritage, makes it his mission to improve the lives of his people by traveling to the Holy Land. Much of the plot, from a feminist perspective, involves Daniel's attempts to help women whom he believes need rescuing. He tries to help Gwendolyn negotiate her miserable marriage with Grandcourt, and he literally rescues the Jewish woman he ends up marrying, Mira, from drowning herself in a river. Right? So on the surface, this novel appears to have nothing whatsoever to do with ancient Egypt, right? And most literary criticism about the novel has focused on the Jewish context for Daniel's character. Those critics who focus on Gwendolyn's character have talked about Eliot's reference to ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. Gwendolyn is, for example, referred to as a perfect Diana worth running after, a reference to the Roman goddess of the hunt. And she's also referred to as part of Circe's herd, a reference to the Greek nymph and goddess of magic. Yet in the novel, Gwendolyn also is depicted as a mummy with a rag face and skeleton toes peeping out, a depiction that I think opens up an entirely different avenue for interpretation of her character, especially given that Daniel is referred to as an accomplished Egyptian who will be like Moses and who will encourage modern Jews to do as the ancient Egyptians did when, and this is a quote from the novel, the Nile overflowed and rushed onward. The Egyptian could not choose the overflow, but he chose to work and make channels for the fructifying waters, and Egypt became the land of corn. So I don't have time to give you all the details of my argument about the Egyptian references in the novel. Our library has an e-copy of the book and hard copy. I also did bring flyers with me where you can get a 20% discount, but I know that doesn't really make the book that affordable. So, it's fine if you want to get it out of our library catalog. I think actually the hard copy is checked out right now, but the ebook version is available to all at any time, right? So my main point, I won't tell you the whole argument, but my main point is, and I hope you get that just from the little part of the argument I gave you, is that if we acknowledge these Egyptian references more fully, we can see that even as Eliot more routinely chose references to ancient Egypt and Italy to depict her characters, she also recognized the power of ancient Egypt and used it selectively to develop male characters positively, but female characters negatively. Nobody likes to be referred to as a skeleton with toes peeping out, right? I believe these characterizations can be traced back to her awareness that ancient Egyptian women might be too threatening to her British audience. So that's a little bit about my Eliot argument, and of course I could tell you about the arguments for the other authors, but I won't for the sake of time. With the time that I have left, what I'd like to do is to briefly touch on two matters. The challenges I encountered in my research and some of the implications of the research. And this is where we'll get back to Google Books in a minute. So in terms of challenges, in the case of Eliot and Nightingale, the so-called historical materials or the literary historical materials I needed, things like letters, notebooks, manuscripts, have been transcribed and published by other scholars. So although it took many, many hours of reading, it was relatively easy to do the research for these chapters, though I should note that it did require a trip, the Eliot chapter did require a trip to London to the Dr. Williams Library, which owns the private collection of George Henry Lewis's books that Lewis and Eliot shared, right? And you can look at those books and see the notations in the books at that library. Many of the Nightingale materials are actually available as ebooks, and this includes, a massive number of letters and the draft manuscript of Suggestions for Thought. So although I could have gone to the Florence Nightingale Library when I was in London, I really didn't have to do it because all of those materials were available to me, and they're available in ebook form. There's an editor, the editor of them is named Lynn McDonald, and then there are kind of sub-editors for these various volumes, but it's like a 10 or 11 volume collection. So that having them available as ebooks, though I tend to read hard copy first, the ebooks were really helpful in terms of searching for particular words or concepts related to ancient Egypt within Nightingale's letters especially. And once I had read the hard copy through once, and I was trying to hone in on particular passages, I especially made use of the ebook version of the Nightingale materials. In the case of Field, research was a little more challenging. At the time I was working on this book, Field's journals were available only in two forms: the original form at the British Library and on microfilm at various libraries, including, thank goodness, UCLA. Do it through the microphone. So I did view some of the original pages at the British Library, and I think there we have an original page. But I mostly worked with the microfilm version, which the librarians at UCLA actually let me check out, and then I brought them over here and I actually viewed them on our own viewers here in Hammond Library. These journals are now actually digitized as part of the Victorian Lives and Letter Consortium. But you can probably see, I don't know how clearly you can see this, but probably from there you can tell, there are some challenges in terms of working with these journals, which is that Catherine Bradley's handwriting is almost unreadable. I mean, it really is difficult to read, and that's her handwriting that you're seeing there. Edith Cooper's handwriting, her writing partner, is a little bit better, and much of the materials in the journals, thank goodness, is written in Edith's hand, not in Catherine's hand. Or sometimes it's written in Catherine's hand and then copied in Edith's hand, which helps out. So working on Field required not just hours and hours of reading, but also transcribing sections of the journals that were relevant to my argument. And there is actually there is actually a larger project of transcribing their journals now through this Victorian Lives and Letters Consortium. Academic scholars have sort of divvied up the volumes of it, and they are working to get good transcriptions that are then going to be posted on the website. But even in my book, there were a couple places where I'm quoting the journals where there were words that were indecipherable, and I just had to note that, right, and recognize that that's one of the challenges of working with these kinds of materials. In the case of Glenn, there is a significant collection of her personal documents at the University of Reading in England, which I did visit, but most of the material there is from later in her career. One potentially helpful document, Glenn's diary, as opposed to her memoir, there were both at one time, was actually destroyed in a fire, according to her granddaughter with whom I corresponded. So this is not the diary, but it is the letter that I got back from the granddaughter when I asked about it. And she says something like, it was destroyed by fire in 1959. So, I mean, that's disappointing, right? But we do have her memoir. We also have a biography by her grandson and a biography of Glenn and her sister by the critics Meredith Etherington Smith and Jeremy Pilcher. But their work and my own is necessarily broadly cultural rather than specifically biographical due to the lack of personal documents such as the diary. Still, I think this is this necessary shift to focusing on the broad cultural ideas Glenn was aware of does contribute to scholarship in important ways. And I think actually that cultural scholarship can point out some things that sometimes narrowly biographical scholarship overlooks or doesn't really recognize because of that kind of attention to biographical details. So when doing research, I think it's important to look at a lack of materials as an opportunity rather than just a loss. And it sounds like I'm starting to lose my voice. So let me see. Maybe I will just skip a few things here. I did want to come back to this idea of my use of Google Books and the rise of digital tools for doing research. I already talked about how helpful the ebooks were you saw me showing images of Google Books, right? And I'm really excited by this kind of new level of access made possible by digital forms of research. But I do also think that it's important to balance traditional and non-traditional, and I always find that I am going back to more traditional forms even as I'm using newer forms of research. I would say, the index in the back of a hard copy book is as important as the search box within a Google book, right? They both serve a similar kind of function, and I think we can recognize the important function they both serve. So lastly, I started summarizing, so that was the slide that went with that. Okay, so lastly, I want to say a little bit about the implications of my research, and especially get to current popular interest in ancient Egypt, because I have some funny photos to show you. Maybe they won't be funny now that I've previewed them for you. So let me just say a word about the first two, recovering the work of women writers and women writers' roles in perpetuating British imperialism, and then we'll get to the fun stuff. This is fun stuff too, but you know what I mean. So the recovery of women writers has been an important goal of literary studies since the 1970s, when second wave feminism brought to our attention to the ways in which women writers have been left out of the literary canon for much of the 20th century. And my book obviously contributes to the effort to recover women writers, not only by bringing attention to non-canonical writers such as Field and Glenn, but also re-examining writers such as Nightingale and Eliot from a different perspective. And I think it's really exciting to go back to canonical authors. I think that's sort of the fun of the field that I work in. And I always try and balance canonical with non-canonical in my own research and in my own teaching. But I do think it's important that any recovery work be done in a manner that looks critically at why we're recovering these writers, right? What value do they add to the canon? And I went to the Modernist Studies Association conference last fall, and there was really interesting conversation about that and about how we recover women writers, right? Like, especially in terms of kind of attention to biography, right? Sometimes we have this kind of single author approach, which is kind of strange given that so much of feminist criticism was trying to get away from that idea of a kind of single author approach to literary studies. So I think that's a really important thing for us to talk about and think about in our own work. In the case of these writers, I'm recovering them in part because they show us something about, I'm not even doing the clicking anymore. Sorry, Emily, I should get the clicker to you. Okay, here we go. So they show us something about British imperialism. We often have the impression that British men were the ones who perpetuated imperialism and colonialism, right? And certainly they had a prominent role in this endeavor. But it's also important for us to recognize that women writers participated in this endeavor too. And while writing this book, I tried to look honestly at how Nightingale, Eliot, Field, and Glenn perpetuated imperialist views. Especially with regard to Eliot, I did have some concern that scholars in my discipline wouldn't want to hear what I had discovered about Eliot because she is such a beloved writer. But I knew that it was important to reveal what I discovered about her. And I think there are other scholars such as Nancy Henry, who is the author of the 2002 book, George Eliot and the British Empire, who had written about Eliot in a more kind of critical way. Henry talks about Eliot's financial investments in South African diamond mines, and that kind of opened the door for a kind of more critical analysis, I think, of Eliot's work. I also tried to put the British women writers I focused on in perspective by including a chapter at the end of the book about 20th century Egyptian women writers who have, as post-colonial critics like to say, written back against the British Empire. And in writing this chapter turned out to be really informative and enjoyable for me since I was able to read writers I don't typically teach, but whose work is quite helpful in seeing very clearly the imperialist views of the women writers that I do teach. So those of you who know a little bit about Egyptian writers will know Latifa Al-Zayat's 1960 novel, The Open Door, which is well known for giving Egyptian women a voice in the discussion about their own emancipation. And I use Al-Zayat's work as a kind of jumping off point for examining the work of other late 20th century Egyptian women writers, including Radwa Asher, Adaf Suef, and Iman Mursal, who's a really interesting poet, by the way, all of whom use what critic Marilyn Booth refers to as heritage imagery or ancient Egyptian imagery to write about issues surrounding Egyptian women's emancipation. So all of them are really fascinating writers to read and writers that I hadn't read before, right? So this brings me to my final point about what we can learn about the current popular interest in ancient Egypt. At the beginning of my chapter about Egyptian women writers, I mentioned some of the many stereotypical images that have been circulating in recent years, including Heidi Klum's 2012 Cleopatra Halloween outfit, right? This is all over the internet, which set off a trend that remains popular, and unfortunately, even I have participated in. So some of you who were around in 2011 might remember that I wore my female pharaoh outfit to class on Halloween night as a way to get my students to class. I don't know if anybody who's here was in that class, but I don't know if this photo circulated widely, but it was a student who took it, so I imagine at least that semester it did, right? And then once I had the outfit, I was like, well, why not use it over and over again? So in 2012, I wore it to a friend's Halloween party in my condo complex. And then in 2014, I wore it again. And my friend Rodney Gordy went along as my mummy. So I don't know, I kind of hesitated to show these, but on the other hand, I mean, I think it also shows that we're all complicit in some ways, right? So anyway, I don't talk about my own Halloween outfits, but I do talk about Heidi Klum's Halloween outfit in the last chapter in the book. I also talk about Elizabeth Peters's Amelia Peabody books. And I mention these in part because they are really quite popular among even some Victorian scholars, because Amelia Peabody's character mirrors real 19th century women explorers such as Amelia Edwards, whose book I showed you a little bit earlier. And yet, in telling the story of an emancipated English woman, Amelia Peabody, Peters relies quite heavily on stereotypes about Egyptian women who are depicted, for example, as, quote, native women swathed to the eyebrows in dusky black in her 1975 novel, Crocodile in the Sandbank, and as, quote, wailing women in her 2005 novel, The Serpent on the Crown. Now, Suef's The Map of Love, which was published in 1999, I think is a really interesting alternative and a good alternative to the Amelia Peabody stories. It's about a late 19th century English widow who travels to Egypt, marries an Egyptian Muslim man, and embraces all aspects of Egyptian nationalist life, including harem life. And I think Suef more effectively avoids some of the stereotypes both about Egyptian women and also about late 19th century English women that, you know, the Amelia Peabody series tends to caricature more. So reading Suef's novel, I think, can help us rethink not only Peters's novels, but also the work of the 19th century British women writers that I've discussed in this book. So ultimately, and this is my closing point, I believe that the reading and analysis of literature does give us important insight into cultural issues of the past and our own time, and highlighting the relationship between literature and culture was one of the main goals of my book. I hope you enjoyed hearing about my work, and I'm glad to answer any questions that you have or discuss anything further that you're interested in talking about. So, thank you.
So we have reserved approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers if anybody wants to begin the conversation. Cynthia Beck.
Hi, Molly. First of all, I want to thank you for addicting me to Mary Elizabeth Braddon.
You're welcome.
Okay, nothing to do with Egyptian,
Right,
unless I've not discovered a novel about that. But
I thought maybe that's the next project.
that would be
no,
awesome.
I don't think so. Nothing comes to mind.
Okay, so we know that there was beyond the women writers you've talked about, a huge interest in ancient Egypt across Western Europe, with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and all sorts of centuries of discussion and discoveries. So I'm wondering, while you're finding these elements within these women's literature, were you surprised by any out-of-the-box or ahead-of-their-time connections, or were they largely just echoing the wider cultural and societal understanding of ancient Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, right? And I'm going through and sort of thinking about, okay, through my authors, is there someone who's really kind of pushing the boundaries, right? I mean, strangely enough, it might be Eleanor Glenn, who in some ways is kind of traditional when it came to women's political issues of her own time, right? But this kind of idea of the spiritual union and the kind of like power that her female character has, who gets represented not just in relationship to Egyptian culture, but also Greek culture, right? And is sort of like traveling the world with, this young British guy in tow or whatever. I mean, I think in some ways she's pushing the boundaries in ways that some of the other writers don't as much. And it's kind of surprising with Michael Field, right? Because I think about Michael Field as an author who does push the boundaries in a lot of other ways, right? Their kind of lesbian lens on aestheticism is definitely groundbreaking, and there's all this kind of amazing, kind of like desire stuff going on in their poems about the European women that they view in art museums and then they're writing about in their poetry, right? But then they seem to become, much more conservative, for lack of a better word, when it comes to the ancient Egyptian, the sonnets that they write about ancient Egypt. They seem to be just sort of replaying what would be kind of widely accepted in British culture, and same thing with Queen Mariamne. I mean, that seems to be sort of more traditional in their view. And they do write actually some of the stuff in their journals is a little bit horrifying. Like they write about the mummies they see in the British Museum in very kind of imperialistic terms. So I think that's a great question, and I think there are some of those moments, but I think overall, and that's why it ends up being the main point of the book, it is mostly from an imperialist perspective. I also just want to sort of point out in related to the fact that you're asking the question, I almost just put in that image that you sent me of the quilt patterns based on ancient Egyptian symbols. So Cynthia found, and I can't remember what journal it was, but it was an American journal, right? Found images in an American journal of quilt patterns that were based on ancient Egyptian symbols. So I think that really speaks to how widespread the craze for ancient Egypt was in the 19th century, not just in Britain, but also, in the United States. The fact that, they're actually really great images. Hi, Amy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
this
coming.
is so great. I should just say I would have loved to read my copy of your book, but you stole it back from me. So
There you go. I brought it for you. Yeah, I had to send copies off to someone else. This was yours.
Oh.
Get it from me afterwards.
That's the only reason I came.
Actually,
So
I'm glad.
with that.
I was like, how many people are going to show up wanting their
Wanting.
copies of the book back?
No, you
I
can-
think you're the only one here.
I'll get it at some point.
Okay.
So I have so many questions, and we just have to have like lunch or whatever,
Yeah,
like
for
a
sure.
solid day of discussion. But so my first question, this may be a short. I have no idea if this is a short question or a long question in terms of its answer. I was surprised that it's Daniel Deronda and not Middlemarch.
Mm.
Do you discuss Middlemarch? So that's my first question, and then the second question, and this is such a historian's question.
Yeah.
Is what changes, because this is a long period, and especially given what was happening with Egypt and Suez, right? All like the changes around the 1880s. I'm wondering what, and let alone the discoveries that were happening across this time about ancient Egypt, but given that you mentioned the modern anxieties about Egypt, do you see change over time, I guess?
Yeah.
Again, I apologize, that's such a historian's
No, that's a good question, right? And I don't know that I can answer it fully. Do you want to piggyback right now, Elizabeth?
No,
She's
right
like,
here,
she's coming
so.
back. So I don't talk about Middlemarch in the book, but I did talk about Middlemarch at a talk that I gave at Cal State Long Beach, and Neil Holtgren from Long Beach is here tonight. He asked me to come and give a talk, and I actually have now written an article based on that talk where I do talk briefly about Middlemarch, right, which is important because Casaubon is like writing his like Kitol mythology or whatever, right? So it's a more obvious example, I think, in some ways, right? But I felt like Daniel Deronda was definitely the better example in terms of thinking about representations of women, right? And how I mean, I didn't even notice until maybe a like fourth or fifth reading of Daniel Deronda that Gwendolyn is referred to as this mummy, with the rag face and the toes peeping out, right? And the way I think I found it was, again, by searching an ebook. I was just searching for references, like I searched for the Nile, I searched for mummy, I searched for Osiris, I searched for Isis, right? And that's actually how it came up. And I was like, I had never even noticed that particular characterization of her, though I had noticed the characterization of Daniel in reference to being an accomplished Egyptian, right? Yeah.
And sorry, do you take the mummy reference to be about her relationship to Grand Court? I mean, is this about, in other words, her kind of tribute and ossification within this dead marriage in terms of their relationship? Because so much of the novel is about the living quality of her relationship with Daniel, as opposed to like that, how Grand Court completely stifles her humanity.
That's interesting to think about that. I'm trying to think about where that reference actually comes. I remember who says the reference. It's that German guy, right, who makes, sorry, I don't remember his name, but it's that German guy who's commenting on people at the gambling tables. So I think it's very early in the novel, and he comments to Daniel, oh, she's a mummy with a rag face and skeleton toes peeping out. And he makes some reference to how Daniel likes historical women, which is a kind of strange reference too, right? So I feel like the kind of direct reference doesn't necessarily connect to her marriage to Grand Court, right? But it would be interesting to think about, what kinds of implications there might be for thinking about that relationship in the book. But it's actually in direct reference to like, what are the who are the kinds of women, or what are the kinds of women that Daniel likes, and that he likes historical women, whereas this German fellow, I guess, doesn't. Yeah. Elizabeth, piggyback your question.
He likes modern women.
Right.
I actually want to ask a question that's kind of about a conjunction, which I know seems odd. First of all, thanks. It's very interesting, and I couldn't help but keep thinking about Sue Marchand's book on German Orientalism, which I mentioned to you when we were in Berlin, actually. particularly when you talked about Florence Nightingale having met with a German
Right.
Egyptologist. But my question is actually, when you were talking about Eliot, you talked about in Eliot's reading of Wilkinson, you used the phrase that she had absorbed the imperialist attitudes of Wilkinson, but understood the privilege accorded to ancient Egyptian women. And this is where I'm going to focus on the conjunction, but it's actually a question that's broader. And I'm wondering the extent to which the focus on the power that ancient Egyptian women had is actually part and parcel of an imperialist reading, right? That they're used as a juxtaposition against modern Egyptian women who are oppressed in a Muslim society, and who are then put in contrast with more emancipated, particularly because of the way Italian and Greek women become models of emancipation. So I guess, I mean, I'm wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about how the ancient functions in these writings relative to the present and as a reinforcement of imperialist attitudes.
No, I think that's right, and I think it's more nuanced than the conjunction but covers, right? And I think some of that goes back to the point I made. I don't know how I'll be about clicking back through slides. You know, I actually came to an earlier pub night just to see how people were using PowerPoint. And the one that I chose, David Moffat, had an amazing PowerPoint. And he was like clicking all around during the question portion. So I don't know that I'm that good at it. But it goes back to that kind of earlier point too, right? That even through an imperialist point of view, there was this kind of acknowledgement of ancient Egypt as a kind of model that Britain could emulate, right? And I think that's part of the reason it is more complex, right? So I know, it's like, I should have just gone all the way back to the beginning. And it doesn't really matter, right? Because you all get my point, right? This is the slide that I was talking about, right? That there is this kind of tension there, right? But that admiration for ancient Egypt as a kind of powerful civilization that modern Britain might emulate probably could use further discussion actually in my book, right? And might actually require further research. I mean, I did some work on like how 19th century periodicals and newspapers were talking about ancient Egypt, but I probably didn't get into the nuances of when are they using references to male gods versus female goddesses, right? And I think that might be one way to go about fleshing out, I think, the really important point that you're making. So, yeah. I don't know, maybe I'll work on that further. Thank you for the point and question.
I want to piggyback on Elizabeth's question as
great.
well. And I don't think I have a question as much as a comment.
Yeah, sure.
As in, I was also wondering whether the focus on ancient Egyptians should also stand out to the extent that it, in a way, masks modern Egyptians.
Right.
This is all they see. And it's something actually in common with how Europeans also saw biblical areas, sort of not the modern.
Right.
But it also stands in contrast to British colonial officers who wanted to emancipate Egyptian women by using Victorian women, which is also interesting and very complex. And then finally, you mentioned Marilyn Booth, who has written also on how modern Egyptian women, late 19th century, but particularly during the First World War, were using British women as models in their own literary magazines to push for emancipation. So there's all these really interesting.
That's right. And I think Marilyn Booth's work on that is very important. There's also someone, I think, Beth Barron, who's written about similar kinds of issues, especially in terms of nationalist discourse and how the kind of figure of women is used in nationalist discourse in the early 20th century. So I was thinking, and maybe it's like the three historians here, right? And so maybe I'm pushing back a little bit as a literary scholar, right, whose primary interest is in literary representations, right? I do wonder if some of the real interest in ancient Egypt as opposed to modern Egypt amongst these particular writers has to do with that kind of literary perspective, right? This kind of interest in the kind of symbols that we find in ancient Egypt and what use can those symbols be to the literary writer, right? I mean, I think it's much more nuanced than that, right? But I do think that that plays a role in the kind of emphasis on ancient Egypt as opposed to modern Egypt. And those were the references that show up in the literary work, right? That it doesn't mean that there aren't any, 19th century women writers writing about modern Egypt, but at least what I noticed in the many women writers I considered, right, is that when they did write about Egypt, it tended to be using these kind of, what Marilyn Booth calls heritage imagery. So that's another great comment. Thank you.
So the historians asked you history questions. I have a library-related one.
Awesome.
So it's actually more. It's kind of a statement, but I just want to hear your sort of feedback on this. So the other day, I was talking to someone in Egypt. I'm not kidding. And a woman in Egypt who I was communicating with through Twitter, and we ended up in this conversation about open access.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about your scholarship and the use of digital and use of physical text. Excuse me. And so how do I say, it's like you're talking about canonical and non-canonical.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about things that are more readily available and things that aren't. You're talking about voices that are represented and voices that aren't as represented or just completely not represented.
Right.
And that's kind of true even with open access, right? Because one of the things we were talking about in our conversation is that open access is sort of a misnomer if not all the voices are being represented. If it's the same texts that were used to cost you money now are free, but it's the same voices. So I just kind of want to hear about your research, dealing with sort of obscurity, dealing with layers of omission, and that kind of work.
And in some ways it's relative, right? The fact that I identify Nightingale and Eliot as canonical women writers and Field and Glenn as non-canonical, right? That's very much coming out of the assumptions of my own discipline and somebody who's working within my discipline. Somebody else might come to this material and say, well, the only writer that I've heard of here is Nightingale, right? And I don't know her as a writer at all. I know her as, the one who basically modernized nursing in Britain, right? So I think in some ways, those questions about what we consider canonical, what we consider non-canonical, how we give space to various voices, right, does come from our own kind of position, right? And my position as an academic who does teach within the literary canon, right? And I think it goes back also to that kind of problem, right, about, how do we expand the canon while also thinking about the value that writers bring to the canon. So I don't know that I'm the right person to comment on open access, but
Just
yeah.
the general concepts of availability.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more material that's available, the better, right? But then we think about like how are we always in some ways selective? So any kind of digital material that's available to me now, I feel like it enhances my scholarship. On the other hand, I have a friend who works in the same field as I do at another university, and she has commented often that the kind of availability of materials now, especially through Google Books, almost makes the experience of doing research overwhelming, and that there's this kind of pressure that she feels like she needs to know everything that's in Google Books now, whereas it used to be, the kind of selective process of making materials available to scholars in some ways narrowed things down for her and made her research easier. So I think there are those kinds of trade-offs, right? But certainly I feel like open access and access to a wider range of materials is ultimately going to be helpful to me as a scholar. So I appreciate that librarian perspective on things.
Okay, if there are no more questions, at this point I'd like to thank the Professor Youngkin. And I'd also like to thank a handful of people. Michael Robinson, thank you for that memorable introduction.